To me and to the introduction, and we're very grateful to have everyone here, and grateful to have Dr. Daniel Sims here with us today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Daniel, let you start your presentation there and connect.
Great, thank you. Dana Chea, my name is Daniel Sims. I'm a member of the Sequedene First Nation, which is about 8 to 10 hours north of where I am right now in Colonialism or Prince George by logging road or flying in. So a fair distance, but Prince George is the nearest, urban center to my home community. So there's a fairly substantial off-reserve population that exists in Prince George. If you're familiar with Prince George, there's a lot of band offices here. So this seems to be the major service community. But I do thank Colonialism for allowing me to be on their traditional territory, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am here, that it is unceded, and that they were forcibly removed from their village site. So there's something that's important to bear in mind. Today I'll be talking about Indigenous foodways, particularly looking at Sequedene foodways. So Sekani, historic name that was used, Sequedene would be the proper name. And just confirm, everyone can see my slide, right? Okay, good. So yeah, I just wanted to premise that because one of the things I always like to say in my talks is that Indigenous peoples, when we talk about diversity, it is something that is true, that does exist, and it's something that's important to recognize. So what I'm saying here is going to be talking about my community in particular. It doesn't necessarily mean that it applies to every other community, internal island. So there may be some similarities, and I would be surprised if there weren't, but just wanted to premise that there. And one of the big differences for my community is our traditional territories on the other side of the Arctic-Pacific divide. So unlike most First Nations in BC, we don't have salmon rivers in most of our traditional territory. So kind of some of the southern western edges, there might be some salmon streams, the very headwaters of rivers where salmon might eventually make it, but the end result was we're not salmon people. So moose is what we primarily get our protein from, not salmon. So that's one of the big differences that exists. And if you're familiar with kind of Colonialism, the actual area, Summit Lake, which is north of here, is where the divide is. So yeah, once you get north of that, you're in Arctic watersheds, and you have pike rather than salmon. So something that's important to bear in mind. And just give you a map here. So showing you the traditional territory of my community. There are currently 4 recognized First Nations or communities: McLeod Lake, Quadacha, Takla Lake, and Sequedene. It is important to point out that Quadacha and Takla are often grouped with other peoples, particularly the Kaska and the Kelth. So there's that diversity that exists and the complexity that is important to recognize there. And our traditional territory is primarily the watershed of the Parsnip and Finley rivers. So it's fairly substantial, but interesting divide. And most of the southern boundary would be that height of land or just around the height of land itself. Again, talking about diversity to the south of the Dekel, salmon is key. So that's something that is really important to recognize. To the west of the Giksan and the Telton. Again, salmon is key. For us, fish wasn't necessarily the main source of protein. It would be some sort of ungulate. So there's that recognition there. And then to the east of the Deneza and the greater prairies. And so buffalo becomes relatively important. And when we look at buffalo, elders in my community will talk about how buffalo used to live in our traditional territory, but we were really on kind of the northern western edge of the buffalo habitat. So there have been some moves in recent years to actually reintroduce buffalo into our territory, which generally consists of my nation buying buffalo and just kind of releasing them on the land. So there is that revitalization effort, but it's something that has taken centuries to actually do because we lost the buffalo relatively quickly. Getting into ethno-husbandry, yeah, really the prestige protein was moose. So we are moose people. We call them hada. And there really is the sense that the proper form of meat is the moose. And moose really plays this central role, not only in hunting, not only in foodways, but even the culture as a whole. It is important to point out when we talk about moose, there are many ways of actually getting moose, including, quite interestingly, snares. So a lot of the elders will talk about historically snares were quite common to catch moose, either by getting something around their legs or getting something around their horn, which is something that is very rarely done today. And indeed, I think isn't necessarily something allowed under the Fish and Wildlife Act, but that was one of the historic ways of getting it. Of course, other ungulates and wildlife were consumed. So moose was kind of the thing that everyone talked about, but elk was also important. And there's larger debates within the community regarding the relationship between moose and elk. So some of the elders will say that moose only live where elk are not, and vice versa. And so they talk about the transition of moose and elk and how overhunting on one or the other will change where the habitat actually extends. And so the transformation goes there. Caribou historically was also another source of protein. The caribou herds, unfortunately, have been decimated, first by the WAC Bennett Dam in 1968, and most recently by forestry. So there is still some caribou in the traditional territory. Same with deer. But realistically, when we're talking about protein, aside from moose, kind of the other prestige animal would be mountain goat and mountain sheep. So we are in what is today now known as northern British Columbia. There's mountains in our traditional territory on all sides. And so if you weren't going for moose, you're generally going for mountain goat, mountain sheep, and then also groundhog. So groundhog is considered a delicacy within the community. And when we talk about foodways, elders will talk about how it has to be prepared in a certain way. Otherwise, you'll get sick. And that has to be hunted in a certain way. So there's a whole history behind that, a whole way of actually getting groundhog and consuming it. And again, not something that people generally think about when they talk about food animals. As I mentioned, the Ockree watershed is salmon free. That being said, we had relations with our neighbors. The grease trails extended into our traditional territory. Salmon was something that was consumed, but generally obtained through trade or through other sort of relationships with neighboring communities, intermarriage being a good example. So family members, we had a lot of family members who are Teltan, including my grandmother, family members who are Giksan, Dekel, Deneza, Casca. So there are those family connections that exist there. And hunting and food preparation was regulated prior to contact. So there were certain rules regarding when you should hunt, what time of the year, which animals you should actually hunt, particularly looking at females and calves or children, but also just the relationships between us and the animals. And within Seke culture, and I believe this is fairly common for a lot of Indigenous peoples in Turtle Island, there was the view that animals were people. My grandmother would say that they actually speak our language, Sekene, and the reason why we no longer hear them speak is because they never learned English. So she was quite adamant that if you learn your traditional language, you can then talk with the animals. And there was this general sense that we were just another one of the animals in the world. So the relationships were reciprocal, respectful, and being warned that if they weren't actually treated with respect, that things could happen to you. So there was that requirement for that respect. And then even with regards to regulation, how hunting occurred, when it occurred, who actually hunted, and then the relationship between women who are on their moon time and hunters who are actually going out and hunting. So how they interact, how they handle each other, if weapons or tools can actually be touched, if people can walk over other people, fairly regulated and still alive to this day. So within the community, within Sekene, Quaracha, and McLeod Lake, people still follow these regulations for the most part. So there has been some changes, but a lot of this stuff is still followed. And recently the province has even, allowed us, and I do hate to say the word allowed because it's very colonial, but allowed people in the nation to actually serve as local game wardens. So recent development, really well received within the community, particularly because we have a lot of oral histories of when the first game wardens actually came in and began to impose their own regulations and the disputes that followed following that. So getting into ethnobotany. So again, it wasn't all meat. There was plenty of plant material fruits and vegetables. I'm not going to talk a lot about berries because berries are kind of a low-hanging fruit, excuse the pun. We had Saskatoon's blueberries, huckleberries, raspberries, strawberries. There are a whole host of berries within the traditional territory that people still regularly pick. And huckleberries in particular are a very popular source of plant material, berries. So yeah, there's that aspect there. I'm going to cover some of the ones that aren't really generally thought about today. And this kind of highlights how foodways have changed, because these are the things you generally won't find in a grocery store, even in the grocery stores that the nations themselves run. And so for Sekere and Kodacha, they both own their own store that they sell to the community. They sell produce to the community, but a lot of it is not traditional produce. So yeah, tree cabium, inner bark, was regularly consumed. Again, this is something that's not regularly consumed today. And most of us are somewhat familiar with this if you're familiar with how aspirin was developed and how Indigenous peoples would actually use willow to access the active ingredients of aspirin. That was one way of doing it, but inner tree bark was also something that could be consumed as a vegetable, as a plant material. Same is true with lichens. I don't necessarily cover mushrooms, but mushrooms are fairly common. Fairy slippers, wild rhubarb, or cow's parsnip. So we talk about the Parsnip River. That's where it got its name in English, was from the cow's parsnip that is up and down the riverbanks. This one's really interesting because cow's parsnip is generally viewed as dangerous, as something you don't want to touch. You don't want to have touch you. But if it's handled properly, if it's actually picked when it's young, it's a very good source of nutrients. But again, this is something that would change after contact, would disappear. And then wild onions, alpine sweet vetch, and cattails. So a whole host of different plant materials. And this isn't an exhaustive list. I don't want to suggest that it is. But it does highlight how foodways have changed. And again, in a lot of instances, people still are consuming these foods, but it is harder to get, particularly if access isn't readily available or if people leave the community itself. So there can be that normalization that exists as well. It's also important to talk about horticulture. So there were plenty of Indigenous peoples in Canada who practice agriculture, particularly on the Great Lakes. We have the Three Sisters, beans, corn, and squash. There are plenty of nations that regularly farmed to produce food crops. For my nation, though, it was largely horticulture. So our traditional territory is not ideal for agriculture. We have an oral tradition about the length of winter. And the gist of the oral tradition is that when the world was created, the animals decided how long winter should be, and they couldn't decide, so they asked Frog, and Frog was very nervous, very uneasy, felt like he was under a lot of pressure, and so he panicked and held up all 8 fingers, and that's why winter is 8 months long. So again, we are a northern community. Agriculture isn't necessarily ideal. That doesn't mean that horticulture was not practiced. And this largely was through encouraging growth. So recognizing which plants were actually edible, which plants were delicious, and then actively encouraging their growth, including planting them, maintaining them, and regularly going and harvesting, but also recognizing that if you over-harvested in certain areas, that the plants wouldn't do so well. So that was one of the big ways of actually practicing horticulture. The other one was controlled burns. And so the image here, the background here is from the BC Archives, the Royal BC Museum. And this is the quote unquote firebugs of Fort Graham. And so this is from the early 20th century. These people were all accused of being arsons. The reality is that they were controlled burns. So they were lighting fires in the forest to actually deal with underbrush, to actually deal with debris, to prevent larger forest fires, which plague the province now that we've spent about 100 years stopping people from doing these controlled burns. This is largely due to, this is largely an attempt, quite successful attempt to encourage growth, not only of plants, but also of animals. So something that was regularly done and something that is documented not only in the oral history, but also in the written record. So Samuel Black, when he came up in the 1820s, is just amazed about the number of small fires that exist when he actually crosses a mountain. And I apparently just lost the lights in my room. So my apologies there. Again, rotating harvest was key. But even one of the things that some of the elders talked about was how the digging tools that were used to promote growth to actually harvest plants weren't sharp metal tools. They're rather blunt tools made of bone, antler. And so this gets into soil care and gets into how you're actually disturbing the soil. If you're cutting into the soil, what is that doing to root systems? What is that doing to other systems that exist in the soil? And again, this is something when we look at farming today is something that is increasingly being considered, particularly with our modern mechanized farming. What damage are we doing to the health of the soil by simply cutting into it year in, year out? Again, kind of continuing with this theme of what actually existed and what didn't exist. I've already mentioned the Three Sisters, but it's also important to point out that that wasn't the only form of agriculture that existed in Rhode Island. So Menomon, wild rice, as it's known in English, was quite regularly planted and harvested around the Great Lakes by the Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples. Looking at aquaculture, Oolican processing, the grease trails. This is something that happened for thousands of years. And again, we didn't necessarily produce the Oolican oil. We didn't necessarily process it or catch the fish. But we were on the end of a number of grease trails. So it was something that we had access to. And that just reflects the trade between the communities. So looking at my community in particular, when the fur traders would eventually come in, they were quite happy that we were already engaged in the fur trade with other Indigenous peoples. So just simply providing new customers for us. But also frustrating them when they were confused when other First Nations weren't particularly interested in actually being engaged in the fur trade per se. Just getting into, again, the topic of this is talking about how contact changed. So when we talk about the Seikene, contact was relatively late, 1793, Sir Alexander Mackenzie. He's the first European that my community encountered. And he talks about encountering us on the Parsnip River, the McGregor River. People run away from him. They eventually come and talk with him. He eventually meets with them. That's kind of his journal record within the community. The oral tradition is that when they saw these people coming on the river in their canoe, they thought the dead had returned to life. So who are these strange people who are so ghostly pale? What is occurring? The dead are walking the earth. Very quickly realized that was not the case, but that kind of represented first contact between my community and Europeans. And then Fort McLeod, or Fort McLeod Lake, was established in 1805. So that's where present-day McLeod Lake is. Quite interestingly, it's the first permanent European settlement west of the Rockies in Canada. And it is actually a national and provincial historic site, largely unknown. And creating that site actually required moving people from the historic village itself. Looking at foodways, one of the big changes with the fur trade was simply changes in economic activities. So the fur traders in particular were directly encouraging people to trap more and more. And part of that was trying to make it easier for people to actually feed themselves. But part of that also was encouraging people to take on more and more debt. So don't waste your time actually going and eating the way your ancestors have. Don't waste your time hunting. Make sure that you're trapping. Make sure you're getting those furs. And I say that as somebody who has looked at fur trade records, conducted interviews with numerous elders in my community. And yeah, the fur traders were quite blunt about that in a lot of post journals. They wanted Indigenous people to focus all of their efforts on trapping, and anything else was deemed as kind of a waste of time, including feeding yourself. So there was that aspect that came into play. And part of that was providing new forms of food, things that the community wasn't familiar with. I do have flour here, and one thing that's important to bear in mind is that for those Indigenous communities that did practice agriculture, flour was something that they had prior to contact. My community didn't practice agriculture, so flour wasn't really something that we consumed. And indeed, the elders talk about how when the fur traders provided us with the bags of flour to get us hooked on baking, people tried to eat it straight. So they just grab a handful of flour, try and eat it. They realized it tasted horrible. But what did happen is that some of them actually spit out the flour over the fire and noticed that the fire would then shoot up. And so they spent a good part of the day actually playing with the flour and burning it. And hardly, not being familiar with what flour was. But this also provided an opportunity for the fur traders to then say, well, this is what you actually do with flour. This is how you bake. So again, the fur traders are very interested in changing those food ways. And part of this was to promote the fur trade, promote trapping. So make it easier for people to focus all their energies on that. Similarly, sugar would be something that would be new, would be introduced, and arguably is one of the lasting legacies when we look at health and food for Indigenous peoples, not only in my community, but in general. So we talk about the obesity epidemic, and some people refer to it as New World syndrome. So this idea that flour is introduced and it is incredibly detrimental to the health of peoples. And part of it is just that it does taste so good, it does taste so sweet. And so prior to sugar, or sorry, I said flour, prior to sugar being introduced, the main source of sweetness would have been honey. But honey was hard to get, so there was a challenge there. Tea would also be one of the new foodstuffs that would really be introduced to the community. It's important to say that when we talk about tea, we're talking about tea is kind of properly defined in English. There were other forms of tea that, of course, pre-existed contact, and people were consuming that, but really supplying kind of that Earl Grey tea that we probably are familiar with. And then brandy. So the fur traders were quite regular in supplying brandy to people. Again, tying it into the fur trade, encouraging people to come and have a party at the actual trading post, using it to their advantage when they're actually trading furs, but just supplying it to the community as a whole. So these would be some of the big new foods that would be introduced to the community. And in some of them, there would be versions that would exist. So elders in my community will talk about actually fermenting berries prior to contact, producing something that would be alcohol, but never in large amounts, and generally for special occasions. The fur trade would simply make it available in copious amounts, huge barrels of brandy and whiskey and other things like that. Again, part of this was the Columbian Exchange. So kind of digging it out from this vacay perspective and bringing it to kind of a Turtle Island perspective. There are a lot of things that were introduced to the community after 1492, and for my community, 1793, that just hadn't existed in Turtle Island prior to that point in time. So things like cattle, pork, chickens. These were things that didn't exist in Turtle Island prior to 1492. They were from Afro-Eurasia. So there would be this transformation that would occur, and it's still something that's an ongoing process. So I had a wonderful conversation with a cousin this summer who really is not sure about cow meat. He really does not like cow meat at all. He really wanted to get my sense of if I eat it, because I live in Prince George, and if I actually like it. But from his perspective, it is a substandard meat, and he does not enjoy it, but he didn't grow up with it. So partly one of the reasons why is that, cattle weren't here prior to 1492 is buffalo. Would be the nearest equivalent there. Even looking at grains, so wheat is not indigenous to the Americas. First wheat in Canada is really grown in 1605. Even dandelions, they're an invasive species. And so in my traditional territory, one of the things in the 20th century was how far north have the dandelions actually gone? And that's something that people aren't generally aware of, because people think that dandelions are actually indigenous. So there was this transformation people refer to as the Columbian Exchange. A lot of things were introduced, and this has changed the way people actually were consuming food, the way things were being changed. Again, part of it was simply supplying the fur traders, the missionaries brought by settlers. So this transformation that occurs. And one of the interesting aspects about it is we define invasive species as invasive because we see them as negative, but things like wheat, dandelions technically would be invasive as well. So they're not native to this continent. And one of the ones where you kind of see the blurring of that line is with regards to pigs. So we all love bacon, pork chops, but they're not indigenous to Turtle Island. And some of them got out, and feral pigs, feral hogs are a problem in the United States, and they're entering Alberta. And it's quite likely with climate change, they'll eventually enter BC. So yeah, these are just domesticated pigs that got loose, went wild, and are doing what pigs do, but because they're not indigenous to the continent, they don't have a natural predator. And they're not necessarily afraid of humans either. So there is that issue that exists. Just kind of continuing here. Looking at other impacts on Indigenous foodways, particularly for my community and traditional territory. Yeah, really 4 big things that have negatively impacted the ability of people to eat traditionally. The first is simply mining. So placer mining, hydraulic mining, underground mining. We live in mountains. There's been a lot of mining starting with things like the Amanita Gold Rush, but continuing to the present day. And if you're familiar with placer mining, it is devastating to the environment in a lot of ways, but it's not devastating compared to hydraulic mining, where you literally blast away the riverbank to try and find what you're looking for, generally gold. So devastating impact on the environment. There's a reason why hydraulic mining is not illegal in BC anymore, but for much of the early 20th century, it was very, very much illegal. And then underground mining. So the where do the tailings go? How are things impacted there? So all of this would affect the people, the ability of people not only to hunt, but also to gather food plants. So where these mines have actually disrupted things, can be incredibly problematic. Forestry really would be more of the same. So you know, forestry entering the traditional territory really in the 20th century and ongoing to this day. And one of the things that's often not thought about with regards to forestry, Indigenous peoples, is very little attention is actually paid to traditional plants, to harvesting areas, and even things like tree planting. It does occur, and it does generally result in trees regrowing in an area, but that doesn't mean the food plants have returned in any way, shape, or form. And in many ways, tree planting can be seen as serving the forest industry rather than Indigenous peoples, and then just farming and ranching. So where it does exist within our traditional territory, it's generally not traditional foods that are being grown. And indeed, traditional foods can often be plowed into the ground or killed as weeds, destroyed in order to make way for what is deemed to be normal in Canadian society, even things like wheat and then settlement and different aspects like that. So things like the instant city of Mackenzie, which is erected within our traditional territory in the 60s. There's no consideration of what impact that would actually have on food plants, on animal life, on anything like that. And if anything, actually led to a lot more competition. So opening it up to hunters, and you know, that's ignoring the WAC Bennett Dam. So having this huge reservoir created in the heart of our traditional territory, flooded a lot of land, killed a lot of plants, killed a lot of animals. And prior to the reservoir being built, the province actually opened up moose hunting. And the only condition was you had to bring the jawbone into Fish and Wildlife, but you could kill as many moose as you wanted. So yeah, just devastating on the population there. Getting away from development, there's also just transmission becomes an issue. And this gets down to how do you actually properly obtain the food? How do you actually properly process the food? How do you actually consume the food? And indeed, what food is actually available? And the first real impact would be disease. So smallpox is kind of the prime example, the amount of Indigenous people that died in some communities up to 90%. This represented a huge loss of traditional knowledge within a lot of those communities. Residential schools would be the next really big hit. So just taking children away from their families, robbing them of their language, robbing them of their culture. And a big part of that is robbing them of their food. So the food that was generally provided in residential schools, and I say almost universally, was non-Indigenous food. It was European food. And this created palates, this created preferences, this created food expectations that just don't align with what people were traditionally eating. And a lot of people, would overcome that. A lot of residential schools would return traditional foods once they left. Our residential school survivors would return traditional foods once they left, but that didn't always happen. And so there's that break there. And then personal preference could also be another situation that existed. So you simply don't like the food, or you don't care for certain types of food. But again, it all plays together, it all intertwines, and it all affects Indigenous foodways, and then just availability. And that ties back to the development. So where do you actually get the food? I live right now in Prince George. Where do I get moose? So it's a legitimate question. In theory, I can hunt in my traditional territory, but my traditional territory is hours away. That means that I'm generally either hunting in the traditional territory of Lake Laytonay or McLeod Lake. Should I be doing that? Am I allowed to do that? And it also means that I'm taking potentially food away from those communities. So one of those issues that exists, and then just the availability of traditional plants. So yeah, in the past, when I was a kid, sometimes we'd harvest things from the ditch. Now that I think about it, probably wasn't the best thing because a lot of those ditches aren't particularly clean. There's a lot of pollutants, chemicals there, spraying from BC forestry, but it just wasn't something we were thinking about. So where do I have to get plant material? Where do I have to get food? There's that issue there. And part of this also relates to normalization. So the image here is moose nose. So when we talk about consuming moose, yeah, the meat is wonderful, but moose nose is considered a delicacy. But it's a delicacy that you can't readily enjoy in Prince George because unless you're actually killing the moose yourself, it's really hard to find moose nose in a grocery store or at a butcher. So it's really hard to consider. And it's arguably also one of the delicacies that people have gut reactions to. So you're eating a moose nose. That sounds gross. Not considering that, again, it is being processed, it is being handled in a certain way. And it gets into that normalization aspect. Also, continued normalization is important to bear in mind. We talk about things like lactose intolerance. Historically, it was viewed as it's weird that you're lactose intolerant, but in recent years, it's been recognized that, over 2/3 of the world is actually lactose intolerant. So in many ways, it is the normalization. Is there a class coming in here?
Yes, I'm 5
In 5 minutes. Wow. Excuse me, I'm going to have to very quickly move where I am because apparently there's a class coming in here. So yeah, there can be that aspect there. And then there's also the question of tolerance and particularly how ethnic foods are viewed and how they can be judged. And so a good example of that is butter chicken. So jokingly referred to as if you like Indian food, but you don't actually like Indian food, butter chicken is what you go with. So that expectation there. So, yeah, my apologies with regards to having to change locations. I didn't actually know there was a class in here. And I'm currently running around, so I will just quickly relocate. And,
yeah, no worries. Dan, we could always just take a quick 5-minute break, or if you want to just take that time to shift, and we can always.
I'll just shift right now. It's all good.
Okay.
So. Sorry, I'm just running around today. So we'll move to another classroom.
Got a little tour of UNBC. Is that, yeah, it looks like you're up there.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things there. Just continuing with foodways, again, social programs also have an impact on how Indigenous peoples actually would engage with food and social work as well. The fur trade in many ways operated on debt. It also operated on capitalism. So there was this expectation among the fur traders that not only do we want Indigenous people to bring us furs, but we want to create this situation where Indigenous peoples are perpetually in debt. And so, they're always owing something to the fur traders themselves. And part of that would challenge the foodways, because how do you actually get people to be in debt? You sell them things. And for a lot of the fur traders, it was selling people food. So get people hooked on brandy, get people hooked on European styles of tea, get them hooked on flour, get them hooked on sugar, and make sure that's what they're consuming. They're not simply feeding themselves with traditional foods. The fur trade also in many ways represents kind of a resource course, or resource curse plus extractive colonialism. So when the fur trade was at its height, it was really easy to make a living by trading furs. But beginning kind of in the 20th century and continue to the present day, prices would drop, money wouldn't be readily available, profits would be fewer. And so there would be this larger issue of people were engaged in the fur trade, but they're not actually making the same amount of money, but they still want the same amount of stuff. And so that would lead to that debt cycle continuing as well. And then the book here that I have here by Hugh Shewell actually argues that when we look at social programs, particularly welfare, that Indian Affairs kind of continued what the fur traders are doing by creating this revolving perpetual debt system, that they actually aimed to create this welfare system, this social program system for Indigenous peoples in Canada that aimed at dependency rather than aid. And so it's, not necessarily that Indian Affairs or Indigenous Services Canada, as we know them today, has created all these systems that don't work or don't work quite right. What Shewell was arguing is that actually they do work the way intended. It's just that the intention was never actually to help Indigenous peoples. It was to create dependency among Indigenous peoples. And many people would see that being paralleled with the size of reserves, but also the format of aid, if available. So keeping people on small reserves, and even when reserves are larger, making sure reserves that are larger don't necessarily include all of the things that people actually need to survive. And the end result is there's no food sovereignty. So Indigenous peoples don't actually have control over their food sources. And so there is still that dependency that exists on the other. So that's one of the things that's often readily identified with regards to how this food would occur. And you can see it is emerging with the fur trade, but arguably continuing to the present day. So there's that aspect. And when we consider some of the things like food deserts, but also the cost of living. So here in Prince George, there's a big question of what happens with the Parkwood Place Save on Foods closes, which is something that is going to happen in the near future. It means that much of the downtown area, a lot of residential areas by the downtown, areas that aren't necessarily well off economically, don't have a grocery store in their area. And so where do they actually get their food? You can get it from convenience stores, but the prices are more expensive, or you can travel to where there is a grocery store, but it creates this food desert area. Outside of urban areas, there's also the issue of the cost of shipping. So how much does food actually cost in community on reserve? Generally, the retail prices are higher, particularly if there's profit that is being sought. And so when I talk about my community running their own grocery store, Quadacha running their own grocery store, one of the big reasons why they do that is because the other option, the Northern store, they're profit driven. So prices are even higher because they are still trying to make that profit. And the Northern store is fairly common in the Indigenous communities of the North. And it is a continuation of Hudson's Bay Company, quite literally. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Northern store, in 1987, the Bay separated their company into the Bay proper and the Northwest Company. And the Northwest Company turned all the Hudson's Bay Company posts that remained into Northern stores. So it's a continuation of this fur trade practice. Again, there are the higher prices that exist, but even with regards to shipping, there can be costs based on not only how much it costs to actually ship food, but also what can be shipped. So for my community, we do have our own store. We don't necessarily sell food at a profit, but even the cost of shipping limits what can be brought in. And then the cost of shipping can also make it incredibly difficult to bring in things like fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. But people still want that because they become normalized. People aren't necessarily going out on the land. And if they can go on the land, they don't necessarily know what to get, what to consume. And then economy of scale can make it even worse. So smaller communities, how do they actually justify the prices when they're selling food like that? And just kind of finishing off here, one of the last issues that I want to talk about is just climate. So theoretically, it's possible to return traditional foodways. There's been numerous attempts to do so. I already mentioned that my community has worked to reintroduce buffalo into our traditional territory. There's been a lot of culture camps, a lot of activities with elders trying to encourage people to eat more traditional foods, consume that. It is something that is theoretically possible. You have the land back movement. So this can be simply returning land to Indigenous peoples. It can also be through modern treaties. It can be through land claims. So there are opportunities to make that return. Development still makes it difficult. So in theory, you can, again, return from development, but it does take a lot of effort and needs to see a lot of attention to detail. So what are you actually going to do? What is actually being returned? But one of the bigger challenges, and something that's kind of in the future and something that my community has increasingly talked about, is simply climate change. So yeah, we've reached that tipping point. It does look like the climate will change. At least this is the assessment that my nation has. And so that raises the question of, okay, even if we restore everything, even if we work to return traditional foodways, what does it mean when the world's 5 degrees warmer and vegetation is changing? What outcomes actually exist there? And then also just larger questions about what does this mean for competition with regards to hunting? So if the environment has changed in the Prince George area so that hunting is no longer viable for a lot of game animals, does that mean people come into our traditional territory to hunt? And then how do we deal with that situation? So yeah, there is that larger issue that exists there. So just in conclusion, just also wanted to briefly mention that I am co-lead of the National Collaborating Center Indigenous Health here in Prince George. This is one of 6 national collaborating centers looking at healthcare and healthy ways in Canada. And I just wanted to acknowledge this because, yeah, I'm co-lead, something that they often ask me to do. And we do provide a lot of wonderful resources looking at Indigenous health that are readily available online. So there's that opportunity there. There's the mailing list and other things like that if you're interested in finding out more information there. And one of the things that we're increasingly recognizing in the collaboration or in the center is that when we talk about health and Indigenous health, it is things like foodways. It is things like returning traditional foods, but it's also more holistic than that. So getting into environmental change, getting into mental health, getting into spiritual health, all the different concepts that exist there. And part of that is challenging kind of the Western notion of what healthcare is. And that is it. I will open up to questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was amazing. And I just want to read, there's already a comment in the chat saying, wow, this is such a great learning experience. Thank you. Definitely going to bring this back to the classroom and school community with 3 exclamation marks. So thank you. And yeah, if anyone in the group here wants to ask questions or start discussion, please do.
You can raise your hand, or if you're more comfortable, just pop your question into the chat.
I have one comment in the chat here. I'm currently working with tribal communities in Northeast India. Very interested in connecting with you on several issues. So I don't know if you want to expand on that to discuss now, but if not, then yeah, I think Peggy will reach out to connect with you more.
Yeah, I'm happy to connect with you regarding that. And you know, it's one of the things that's important to bear in mind. I'm talking about my community specifically, but these are larger global issues. And Indigenous people exist around the world. So it's not just Canada. Yeah.
Daniel, I'd like to say too that I'm working with 2 communities in particular right now, and they're really looking for solidarity, for connections with other communities that are facing some of the same challenges, because it's a very isolated region that doesn't have the sort of global picture that a lot of other communities have. And I think they're very heartened to know that there's an opportunity for them perhaps to connect with some of the First Nations people here in British Columbia. So it's really exciting for me to think about being able to be a conduit for that. So I've really enjoyed what you had to share today. And are you going to, I missed the first part. Are you going to be sharing a copy of the presentation online? Will it be available?
I don't believe so, but we have the recording, but I'm happy to connect with
Great.
people.
Great, thank you.
I see here in the chat, there's a question from Ann Saar. Wonderful information. Can you talk about food sustainability going on in your territory? So yeah, I can talk a brief bit about it. And as I mentioned, one of the big concerns in the community is climate change. So what happens when the plant life begins to actually change because the temperatures are different, forest fires ravage the community. These are larger conversations we're having, but one of the key aspects of sustainability is that we're dealing with the impact of the WAC Bennett Dam, of mining, of forestry, on what is actually available, what can be harvested, how accessible it is. There are larger concerns like that. But one of the things the community has actually been actively trying to do is make sure that the older ways of actually regulating harvesting, regulating hunting, and encouraging sustainability are communicated to the use of the community and are enforced by the community itself. And so sometimes that can be simply shutting down hunting. And one of the bigger issues kind of going with the colonial system, the colonial structure, is that in the past, it was really hard for the community to actually encourage the province to go along with that. That being said, now that many people in the community serve as the game wardens, there's a lot more availability towards that. But yeah, it's one of the big things the community is actively interested in. And part of it is simply recognizing that things aren't necessarily guaranteed to continue to exist. So how are we going to move forward so that our children, our children's children can continue to enjoy moose, enjoy huckleberries, enjoy the various foods that exist within the territory. And we are lucky as a nation, and this is kind of the exception rather than the rule in Canada. We don't have a lot of European settlement or non-Indigenous settlement in our territory. So it's largely forestry, largely mining. But even with regards to that, one of the things my community recently was looking at was even getting the timber license for our traditional territory from the province. So in the past, it had been held by Canfor, which is a major multinational forestry company. My nation began to look into how do we actually get that license, not necessarily so that we can log the traditional territory, clear cut it, but out of a recognition that we are stuck in the system. And one of the best ways of actually making sure that we can promote sustainability, promote food sovereignty, is by making sure that we're actually in control of where logging occurs or where it doesn't occur. And so interesting prospect of maybe the nation acquiring this timber license and then sitting on the timber license and saying, okay, we're not actually going to log. We just have it so that we can say no one's logging. Whereas in the past, it would have been a conversation with Canfor. So I hope that answered your question.
That's great. Thank you. No, it was really interesting. Yeah, totally. Wonderful. Good luck.
Thank you. See here. Just looking through here. Denise's question: is there any programs or will it be for teaching, gathering, preparing of Indigenous foodways in the Prince George area? I don't know of any programs that are kind of widespread, but I do know that a lot of nations have programs within the community. So one of the things my community does and Quadacha does and McLeod Lake does is we have culture camps. And this is where we actually take elders and children in the community and make them go out and hunt and camp on the land, harvest on the land. Usually takes place in the summer. It's usually for a couple of weeks. And part of it is not only harvesting food, hunting, but also teaching culture and language. So the children are actively encouraged to not use English during those time periods, and the elders are actively encouraged to teach the children how to speak the language. So it's something that we do. There's a number of other communities that have similar programs, but it is generally based on the community as a whole. So it's kind of haphazard based on who's doing what. There are some kind of larger, I think, programs with regards to like the Native Friendship Center and things like that. But I don't know how widespread they are, how regularly they actually occur. I'm curious about opportunities to connect with traditional food practices for people living in urban areas. Yeah, this is one of the larger issues. What do we do with the off-reserve community? How do we deal with people in urban areas? This is a number of approaches that have been taken for the culture camps that I mentioned. It can be encouraging people to actually send their children to the camps, even if they're not living in the community. And so that can be involve the nation working a way for people to actually leave urban centers and actually return to the land and engage with the land. Another option that has existed, this can be hit and miss depending on the family, but also depending on the community, is simply working and encouraging people to actually share food when it's available. So kind of a basic example of that would be because I live in Prince George, my two sisters live in St. Them simply providing me with moose meat throughout the year. So providing that as an opportunity. But yeah, it's one of those opportunities that exist. And then with regards to things like the Native Friendship Center or even UNBC for that matter, sometimes there can be certain programs where it's kind of not nation specific, but it is still aimed at connecting people to the land and connecting people with those foodways. But it can be a challenge. That gets in a larger conversation of the urban Indigenous experience in Canada in general. So how do you connect people with community?
Thank you, Daniel. There's also a hand up here from Elizabeth Moore.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you wanted to.
Yes, how hadalas stilang kilagang Elizabeth Moore hinu dikan di au hadagang diu yakujangagang how stilang kilagang. I just wanted to mention here on Haida Gwaii, I work in the north end of the island. We just before school was out, we gave each school some prawns to work with because it was getting close to graduation. So I said, use it for your grad ceremony. But in this past weekend, we in using the machine, the canning, not jars, but you use a machine to seal up cans. We sealed up smoked salmon and plain salmon and some crab. And we made jam. So we're going to bring that to the schools, each of the schools with our nonalung, our nonnies, our grandmothers, so that they can give them our food that we as Haida people eat. And they need to eat that. Our children need to eat that even in school. So, and then you were just talking about sharing traditional food. So then I thought of Hobie's coming up. And so I'm going to see who I can take from our community up there with cases of canned crab again. And hopefully I'll get some halibut as well. And just go and enjoy the singing and the dancing for 2 nights and get on the ferry and come home. But that's like with our youth and our old people as well. Hawa.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And you actually reminded me, so we actually had an Ulukan class here at UNBC. It wasn't necessarily in the Prince George campus. It was actually, I believe it was in the Nass Valley with the Niska, but they actually organized a class, and that was the whole point of the class, was processing Ulukan oil. So they'd catch the fish and they'd process it. And again, those opportunities do exist, but it is something that largely happens in the Nass Valley for UNBC's perspective. So we don't do that here in Prince George. So it can be limited in that aspect. But yeah, they do exist. You know. I just see here there's a question, are many BC communities active in harvesting management plans and forestry management planning with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Fishery, specifically moose harvesting plans? I don't actually know how many nations are involved, I'm going to be honest. I do know there's more and more nations that are involved. Part of it is with regards to the modern treaty process. So the provinces tend to take the approach that they don't necessarily want to sign treaties, they want to have interim agreements. Which is not necessarily ideal, but some of that can be harvesting, some of it can be forestry management planning, but it also depends on the location of the community, but also the capacity of the community. So what are the issues the community is facing? where are they located, who are they actually engaging with. But I do know there's more and more communities that seem to be doing it, but I don't know how many communities in general. So yeah, and there's, just for reference, there's over 200 different First Nations in BC. So it's a large number of communities. Some of the communities do work together, which is important to recognize, but others don't. So yeah, I don't want to make any blanket statement. I don't have anything close to approaching the numbers, but I do know that it does seem to be something that's more and more common. Just looking here at the questions. Yeah, there's a question about how you create these culture camps for students who are living in urban settings. I've kind of already answered this one, but I think the big one is just particularly for the culture camps, if it can be the nation involved. One of the opportunities that might exist is for the nation to actually make sure that they are including people living in urban centers, so that there is that connection back to their home community, and that they're actively encouraging people to return to the land. But that can be limited by the capacity of the community, the resources that are available. That being said, there are organizations that can exist, like the friendship centers that might be able to take on some of the activity. And then depending on the connection that people living in urban centers have to the nearest First Nation, there might be opportunities there to work with that First Nation. So, but it's, again, highly specific, and also one of the larger issues, how do you actually include people who are off reserve? I don't think there's any First Nation that's really perfected that approach, which is kind of an ongoing issue in general for most things dealing with the urban community. I was wondering what opportunities you see. Just kind of get my question here. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll up here. There is a question about bringing Indigenous foodways into the K-12 system, particularly in predominantly settler communities. I think the biggest opportunity there is that the province in BC in particular has mandated that there has to be Indigenous content in K-12. I think that I don't know how long it's going to last. Hopefully it'll last forever. But I did live in Alberta, where Alberta did a lot of backtrack in the last few years, removing Indigenous content. So I don't want to pretend that everything's necessarily ideal. But I do know here at UNBC, for example, all of our education students moving forward are being required to take mandatory Indigenous content, even get a teaching license. And a big part of that is there's that requirement that to graduate in BC from high school, you need to have the Indigenous content. And I think Indigenous foodways is a great way of actually including that content. And in some ways, depending on the food content and depending on the cultural teaching surrounding the food content, maybe a culturally appropriate way of actually including Indigenous culture, which can be a whole host of other issues. Who has the right to teach about the culture, what cultural teachings can be taught, who can share them. Food might be an opportunity there. And food also brings people together. So there are those opportunities that exist as well. And it can also be with sustainability in general. So, there's that idea of let's try and make sure that we're harvesting food within 100 kilometers of where we're living. People in the north, particularly in northern BC, will often say, well, where we can get all our food. And a lot of that is predicated on the assumption that you need to have kind of the Western food approach and have food that isn't necessarily grown in the immediate area. I think downplaying the food that does exist here that people don't recognize. So yeah, I think there is opportunity there. And I see that Vicky posted a toolkit. So I encourage people to actively use that toolkit. So. Looking to see if there's any other questions in the chat. It doesn't look like there are. So
A lot of thank yous and a lot of people
Mhm.
inspired to bring some of this back to their classrooms, which is great to hear. So Daniel, I don't know if you are you happy to wrap up now, or is there anything else
Yeah.
that you wanted to add before we
No, I'm happy to wrap up. I wanted to apologize for having to change my venue midway through the talk. So just in all transparency, I taught right until we started. So I had a class in that room and I taught, and I knew there wasn't a class after my class. I just didn't know that it was there would be a class coming in eventually. I thought we were close enough to the end of the day that I could just be in that classroom. So my apologies for that.
I think we were all impressed at how well you took it in stride, so
Yeah.
well done.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you so much. Just going to share my screen once more so Vicky can just share a few things about what's coming up here.
Yeah, so we have one more session for this Northern Indigenous Foodways Learning Circle series. It's with Julian Napoleon. He's going to be talking about our sort of plant relatives and native species, and I'm going to add the Eventbrite link into the chat here. And we encourage you to join us because I think it's going to be really awesome. It's going to be the last one, and I think we've had such good feedback on these learning circles that we're going to do our best to try to continue them on into the future. Sorry, I'm going to put this in the chat. If you want to get in touch with either Roanne in the North Central region or myself in the Northwest, if you are in any of those school districts, or even if you're not, feel free to contact us. My email address there is, I'm not Margot, but if you write to
Sorry,
Margot,
that was
I'll
silly.
still get the email. And you can also just go on to the Farm to School BC website at farmtoschoolbc.ca, and you can find a list of the community animators either in the north or anywhere else in the province.
Yeah, thank you. And please reach out and we can also connect you at Daniel's lovely invitation to follow up and connect. So yeah, you can reach out to us and then we can make that connection there. And anything else, any other questions or support, big or small, we're here to help. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Daniel. We're very grateful to have had you with us.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, have a lovely evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sims.
Have a good night, everyone.